We've made it through our first 6 Phoenix Kings that have been kings during the times of war and of strife. Today we're going to go into the latter portions of kings, and this time it's going to be a lot less direct conflict. Scholars, builders, seamen... seamen are going to be the subject matter today versus the many generals and bastards looking at you, Calidor II, that we dealt with in our last video. So let's get things started here with the Scholar King. Now, Bellecour Hadras is our first wizard king, and he ruled from a nice long rule from 1 to 1190. This is Imperial calendar minus 691 to 499. Belcore Hadras is again the Scholar King. He's our 7th king. And he was already a famed scholar and notable spellcaster from Safari before the council made him the Phoenix King. And he was a very well-loved, respected, and venerated king of the people. And what marks his reign above all the other Phoenix bros is that there was a near to absolute zero conflict during his era. Tethys' bloody trail to the north had really weakened the Dark Elves so much that they were actually afraid to take part in any raids or any attacks on Ulthuan for fear of rousing the army that Tethys had used to wipe the island clean of their twisted kin. And the result of Tethys' war of reclamation was that the majority of Ulthuan lay in ruins, and the Anuli Mountains were unguarded, allowing for manticores and other beasts to maraud through the countryside, looking for fine linens and precious shoes in which the High Elves keep locked away. Because, I mean, what manticore doesn't want to wear nice flip-flops? Thus, Belcore Hadras' first decree was an age of rebirth for the High Elves and of Ulthuan. All of the ruined settlements, destroyed towns, and defenses of the island were repaired, reclaimed and rebuilt as Ulthuan returned to a state of normalcy. And up to this point, we've only seen Phoenix Kings in power for really some 600 years. The longest living was Belshazzar at 1600, which was arguably the height of the High Elves Empire, and with them all elves being united under one banner and all. But Belcore Hadras, brought about a second golden age for the High Elves, ruling for just shy of 1200 years, and he was responsible for the construction of the White Tower of Hoth in Safari. This grand repository of knowledge became a beacon across the land for elves to share their research, philosophy, and magic knowledge. Gathering grimoires from across the world, all wisdom and knowledge was kept behind the heavily guarded walls and wards of the tower. In a lot of the entries from books and whatnot, they talk about how the tower has these huge sweeping enchantments and all these many runes that block it and guard it with these twisting mazes that appear and illusions that appear, so it's very heavily guarded in and of its own right here. But with the construction also began the legacy of the Jedis of the Warhammer world, the lore masters and sword masters of Hoth. They gathered at the tower to study swordsmanship, warfare, sorcery, all disciplines that the tower had to offer. And additionally, the lore masters started the Book of Days, a massive tome chronicling the great history of the elf people, stretching back to before Anarion to the present era and onward. And Belcore Hadras was not a fool though, and he knew that war would revisit the shores of Ulthuan as it always does. So rather than allow his nobles and princes to become kind of idle in their time of peace, he charged them with the purification of the island, destroying the many warped beasts from the Anuli Mountains in order to seek personal glory, a higher skill, and peace for the people. Like the sword and wisdom kind of became the moniker of princes and nobles at the time. It's really how you established your worth. Really, Belcore Hadras is an amazing king, not because he didn't have conflict, but because he was able to galvanize the two major facets of the Elven people, the scholarly and the martial. By putting the princes and scholars to work toward the greater good of the High Elves, he established an amazing empire that would carry the elves into the current era as we see them today. And he died peacefully shortly after the construction of the White Tower of Hoth and was buried as part of its foundation. He still kind of haunts the deep crypts of the tower, helping wayward scholars that are in search of knowledge, or even appearing to Teclis as he toils over some grand problem that escapes him. That's done many times in the books here and there. But the peaceful reign that Belcore Hadras had established was passed on to Aethys of Safari. Aethys the poet, our 8th Phoenix King, who had a nice 623 years of Phoenix Kingdom, in which this is IC 499 to 1211. And Hathors is the first king at number 8 to inherit the throne without some sort of kingdom-wide instability or in the wake of warfare. And as a whole, the Dark Elves were considered in rapid decline by the High Elves. Malekith being rumored to have finally died off, the dwarves were content being left alone, and the Empire had just recently arisen, like the Empire of Man is what I say when I mean that. But truth be told, it had started during Belcore Hadras' reign, but the elves weren't now just kind of hearing about it. But this is the era that the elves discovered that they were really a dying race. The number of births was just declining, and there's no real reason for this, nor is there an explanation. One of the more haunting sentences from the lore is, "The great cities began to empty." Now that sounds kind of like benign, but if you think about it here, like I've said many times, the Tyrion and Teclis trilogy talks about how empty Lothern is, like it was built for a civilization that never really lived in it. It kind of just is eerie to me, and it just unnerves me. I don't like it. It's like having one foot in warm water and one foot in cold water. That's freaky too. But on that note, Lothern was raised from a small fishing village to the great city that it is today, ferrying trade into the great kingdom as the primary trade port of the High Elves. And under Hathors, culture thrived throughout the inner and outer kingdoms. On the back of Belcore Hadras' reign, and now Hathors' reign, the elves hadn't seen conflict in almost 2 millennia. Much of the army and fleets were just disbanded. The funds were used on more which I guess you can call civilized pursuits. And Hathors, being an elven dandy who likes himself a good turn of phrase or two, attracted artists from all walks of life: painters, sculptors, dramatists, writers, everything. A gigantic griffin sculpture 500 feet high was created on top of the Griffin Gate. All these kind of animated portraits, like something straight out of Harry Potter, were made. A lot of just sweeping cultural movements were done. And the mountains of Trace were beautified by artisans and sculptors. If you play Total War Warhammer 2, you can actually see a lot of the many statues and art that was created into the alcoves of the mountainside when you play or when you go up to the mountains of Trace. You can see them along those mountainsides, or actually on the tops of the peaks, going from the inner kingdoms to the outer kingdoms. It's actually kind of a really cool touch. But trade was firmly established with Cathay, as silk, jade, and other spices made their way into Ulthuan, becoming marked commodities of a new sort of intelligentsia class that had arisen within the kingdom. And even the dwarfs were approached to establish trade and return the Phoenix Crown, which they immediately rebuked, but with no insult or conflict that resulted. Complacency had really set in for the High Elves here, though, and as a result, the nobles and princes returned to their intrigue court rather than their martial pursuits. Sword and wisdom no longer becoming the watermark of a worthwhile lord. Now it was thinly veiled insults and silver-tongued remarks. And Illyrian remained true to their kind of martial ways, though. This is that main entryway into the inner kingdoms from Nagarath. Prince Valador of Illyrian ensured that the Griffin Gate got the best arms, armor, and training offered to his men. But even that could not spare him the intrigue court that eventually robbed him of his title, land, and estate for his entire family, all because he punched some noble that was falsely working under the king's orders. Like the guy was stealing from the Griffin Gate's armory. He said, "Oh, I'm under orders of the king." And he punched him and said, "No, you're not." And the king's like, "Yeah, you're right. He wasn't." But the noble still fucked him over in the end. But it was an interesting time because while the kingdom was thriving, there was a certain moral decay, namely of court, the cult of pleasure resurfacing as a larger and larger part of society once more. And the Tower of Hoth led investigations into the cult's dealings, and before long discovered a plot from the Chancellor of the court to raise the Senate against the Galactic Empire and start a new reign as Darth Palpatine. Oh wait, shit, wrong game. Sorry. So the Chancellor of the Court is really, at that time, he's the closest confidant to the Phoenix King. And the High Master Morvael confronted the Phoenix King with this information, informing him that the Chancellor was an agent of Nagaroth. The result, though, was swift. The Chancellor stabbed a poisoned dagger through Hathors' heart, which is super final as it is. Was the poison that necessary? Hey, we'll just cut his head off, then light it on fire and kick it down a fucking mountain just to be sure. But either way, The elves saw peace for nearly 2,000 years, but their dreams of a diminished enemy would quickly become just that, dreams. Morvael, the impetuous of Ivris, the High Lord Master during Aethys' reign that informed him of the Chancellor's misdeeds, would inherit the throne. This is our 9th king. He lived for 383 years during the imperial calendar of 1121 to 1503. But while he was a scholar in his own right, he had little knowledge of statecraft or warfare, and as thus, his first act was a preemptive strike against Naggaroth, launching an elven fleet, which was massacred almost to a man. And the few survivors spread word that the Dark Elves were not diminished, but in fact had been growing stronger while the elves grew complacent. So there's a number of implications here, right? First, for however long the Chancellor was in place, he was a direct conduit of communication back to Naggaroth. But this is really no surprise, as much of the lore and fluff describes as this is pretty commonplace. You know, the High Elves thinking that the Dark Elves are none the wiser, while their most trusted nobles princes are actually Dark Elves, whatever. But second, there's a notion that the population of the elves for a dying race is however many are needed for the plot. That's like a kind of like a repeating sentence that Games Workshop employees would always tell you. It's like, hey, how many elves are there left? He goes, however many are needed for the plot, kid. So we never get numbers or figures, but if the Dark Elves were increasing in strength after a crippling campaign from Tethys, then their birth rates are invariably up by comparison to the High Elves. So, your greatest enemy are breeding like rabbits, while the rest of y'all are dry humping silk from Cathay? Disgraceful. But this immediately spurred the Dark Elves into action, launching a massive armada that seized the Blight Island and reclaimed Tor Anlek, raising a new fortress in the ruins of the old and besieging the Griffin Gate. And control of the military control of the military as a whole was handed over to Mentheus of Calidor, Morvael's closest friend. And Mentheus helped win the fight over the Griffin Gate, just desperately winning it back for the High Elves. Morvael called in the troop levy system that was set up by the previous Phoenix Kings to add troops to the beleaguered Griffin Gate. In addition, he poured all the money from the coffers of the Phoenix throne into rebuilding the army and creating a massive and powerful fleet. In addition to that, again, he used the Swordmasters of Hoth to act as counter-spies, or at least a counter-spy network, rooting out any influential spies granted by the Cult of Pleasure. And for all of this, Morvael was a very high-strung and sensitive individual. He was constantly worrying about his friends and those that he would be sending to their deaths. And as the years ticked on, the weight of the Phoenix crown pushed heavily upon the shoulders of the king. And during this time, he relied ever more on the strength derived, I guess you could say, by his closest advisors, especially Mentheus of Calidor, relying on the general's friendship just as much as he did on his general's leadership abilities. Despite all this, the High Elves are embroiled in sporadic warfare throughout the latter century of Morvael's reign. To ensure the trade routes established during Aethys' and Belcore Hadras' reigns were secured, Morvael set up the Fortress of Dawn at the tip of the Southlands, while the Citadel of Dusk was set up on the opposite shores at the tip of Lustria, both kind of safeguarding any ships making their way to Cathay or back. And the culmination of these conflicts happened at Tor Anlek, when Mentheus besieged the great fortress at the head of a large elven host. And Morvael awaited the outcome at the Shrine of Assyrian, plagued by insomnia, nightmares, and worry for the well-being of his kin. And day in and day out, more reports of the casualties made their way to the shrine. Eventually, the forces of Ulthuan won out against their dark brothers, destroying the fortress once more. But the victory came at a high price. Mentheus was slain during the last assault on the final day. His dragon went into a berserk rage, cutting a huge swath through the Dark Elf lines. But once Morvael heard news of this, it was more than he could bear, and he cast himself into the internal flame of Assyrian. His body smoldered on the sacred flame for a whole 12 hours. Even though Morvael was crippled by indecision, he still established a great deal of security for Ulthuan, and that bore, or I guess the fruits of it, bore the current era of peace that his forebears had created him and for him. And we really don't see that kind of ending, that peaceful reign until Finbar. I mean, a lot of this peace is a good thing, because had there been that constant conflict, we would have seen the elves probably depleted to a point that they wouldn't even be in 8th edition. Like, oh, do you guys all remember the high elves? Yeah, they were fucking cool. Well, because of all this peaceful time, they were able to replenish their ranks to set up the next stage of things. Setting up for bel-hathor the Sage, our 10th Phoenix King, who ruled from 1 to 661. This is Imperial Calendar 1503 to 2163. Bel-hathor, the 10th Phoenix King that we were just talking about, comes at an interesting time. A lot of the intrigue court that was generated during Aethys' reign was still very present, and with the council decided on whether to appoint a warlike king or a peaceful one, the result was bel-hathor. It was split down the middle pretty much. And bel-hathor of Safari was expected to be a relative pushover. Like when you went to your mom to see if you could have a girls' sleepover, but, you know, no boys except for Ben and Jerry's. I'm so bad. Anyway, bel-hathor was expected to be easily manipulated, but that was not the case. In fact, he was extremely strong of will and resisted all hands seeking to get into the cookie jar. There was a large outcry for an invasion of Nagaron, but bel-hathor denied the masses, noticing that a victory could have been won, but it would cost the High Elves too much. And already most of the cities were half empty as it was, and many of the lands, estates, and mansions were abandoned. So instead, he set his eye to the defense of the nation from the east. Human empires had grown rapidly in only 2 centuries, and incursions of Norskins became both more frequent and more vicious, to the point that the High Elf Navy could not contain them and defend against the Dark Elves at the same time. Bel-hathor convened the Lore Masters and greatest mages of the time to weave a grand enchantment upon the eastern approach to Ulthuan, kind of like setting up waystones and runes all over the place. But after 30 years of planning, the magicians enshrouded the island with mazes, illusions, shifting shoals, and mists. And the only way to approach Ulthuan was out of sheer dumb luck, really. And this point really kind of creating an air of mystery and dread about the elf lands to the west. You know, quotations there like, oh, the dreaded elf lands, don't go there. But the men of the Empire, Betonia and Norska, still braved the enchantment, but very few of any consequence really made it through to be considered a threat. And bel-hathor had deemed that no man was allowed to set foot on Ulthuan's soil. Finbar, the Prince of Eataine, was granted permission, though, to take ship and learn more of the emergent realms and the outside world, which the High Elves had really been cut off from by their own doing. I mean, they weren't seeking the tutelage of the humans, or for that matter, the dwarfs. They had really kind of had like a closed door policy inadvertently by really kind of focusing fully on Ulthuan and their enemy to the west. But Finbar first sailed to Liangui in Bretonia, and from there he spent 50 years wandering over the old world like an Aryan so long ago. And this is the first time any High Elf has seen the race of men outside of the barbarians that they were thought to be. You know, Norskins are their only real exposure to quote-unquote men up until this point. And as Finbar made his way into the lands of the Empire, he was shocked to discover that the humans had built massive cities with spanning walls and disciplined armies to fight off orcs, you know, crude technology rather than the kind of mud huts that he had expected. And the feud with the dwarfs had seen the High Elves devoid of the Eastern realms for millennia. You know, they're like, well, all right, the stunty legs have that, we're not going to go over there. But he even entreated with the Wood Elves, who regarded Finbar with not much else other than indifference. But again, he was shocked to see how far they had come from their High Elf roots, and that they didn't even resemble High Elves any more than the Dark Elves resembled High Elves. So, upon returning to Ulthuan, Finbar met with bel-hathor and told him of the grandeur that had unfolded in the Eastern realms. And bel-hathor immediately overrode his initial decree that men were not allowed to set foot on elf soil, and opened up trade and diplomacy to human empires to the east. Really, the goal here was that, and this is Finbar's take on this whole situation, was that these guys are way better off as allies than they are as enemies right now. Because if we have an enemy that is like the humans, and he kind of notes how overly tenacious and full of life and greed they are, it's not going to be a good thing to have a war on 2 fronts here. So Bel-hathor, I think, really agrees with that wisdom, and that's what he's like, oh, okay, oh, let's let trade coming in. So Lothern exploded once more, swelling with trade and commerce, becoming the largest port and trading city in the world, with Marienburg hot on its heels. Finbar was thrilled to see his homeland of Eataine step into the center stage as Lothern became the seat of true power in Ulthuan. It was always the seat of the Phoenix throne, or court, but this kind of elevates it even further. Bel-hathor died peacefully, though, in his bed, and Finbar was the obvious choice for successor. Now, although we talked a lot about kind of Finbar in this entry here, I want you guys to really get a sense for how Bel-hathor created the Ulthuan that we see in either Total War Warhammer 2 or in 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy. Lothern as a seat of power, the shrouds over Eastern Ulthuan that Gron the Paunch eventually evades through, all of these things help, again, to maintain and secure the strength created from the end of this kind of golden age of the High Elves. This does not, of course, cheat our last and current Phoenix King, Finbar, who is number 11 on our list, and I don't want to say the last, he's the last, but I mean, he's not the last king of the line, there's more kings to come, well, fuck. So, he rules from 1 to the present era. That's Imperial Calendar 2163 to, again, the present era. And Finbar the Seafarer was the first Phoenix King to be directly chosen by his predecessor, Bel-hathor. And the council honored that request and appointed him Phoenix King. Now, if you think about it, he was really the best man for the job. He was from Lothern, a prince, and a traveled individual who knew the world for what it had become. He was the best choice as he understood the kind of new age that the elves found themselves in, as well as knowing the ins and outs of trade and commerce as a result of being from Lothern. In the early years of Finbar's reign, though, he still took to the open seas, sowing treaties and establishing trade throughout the old world to better establish his kingdom and elfdom as a whole. Trusting the dealings of the day-to-day to be run by his accomplished advisors, which, I mean, in all rights, that's a good king right there, right? Like, all right, I'm going to trust the people that I've put in place to run. Sans corruption, but whatever. This, of course, didn't sit well with some elements of the court, namely the elements that were overlooked for the position of Phoenix King in Finbar's stead. So, like High Elves do, they spread a shit ton of intrigue, rumors about the wayward Phoenix King, talking about situations about his manhood, the kind of crap that people say. And this went on until Alarielle arrived, unannounced, at a meeting of the ruling council, kind of kicking the door in and demanding rent money like an absentee landlord. Alarielle reminded the gathered princes of their loyalties, her icy gaze piercing each elf to their core, driving off in her Prius with great miles to the gallon. But since that day, there have been no dissenting voices in the court. Interestingly enough, this is one of the first times we hear of the Ever-Queen taking a hand in the dealings of the Phoenix King, even less likely to come and defend his honor in his absence. I mean, we don't hear about that at all, if ever, in the lore of any other Phoenix King. That being said, most Phoenix Kings aren't extrapolated much in the lore. Belcore Hadras is expanded a little bit more in the lore because, the White Tower and everything, but Anarion, the first, 4 are pretty big, and then the latter 1 and 2 are kind of huge, but it just kind of, again, puts stuff into kind of frame of reference of how rare this is. So, it sets a pace for Finbar's kind of reign, where in this grand unification and ending of a lot of the High Elf tradition that is more stuffy and archaic kind of comes to pass, and we get a more kind of new age High Elf. And over time, Finbar went on less and less voyages, instead spending more and more time working on the interior of Ulthuan with his trusted advisor, Belianar, the oldest and wisest lore master of Hoth. You might know him from some of the cutscenes that we see in Total War Warhammer 2 in the High Elf campaign. On the 138th year of Finbar's reign, the Great Chaos Invasion began, starting off the Great War with chaos in the Old World. This then spurred on another invasion from Malekith, that just bastard ass. This was more of a calculated and destructive war that swept aside the many defenses of Ulthuan. used the might of Inkari, the greater demon of Slaanesh, to hunt the elves, and the emergence of two great twins, Tyrion and Teclis. The twins kind of helped to save the realm, and Tyrion rescued the Everqueen from a burning Averlorn, and the culmination, I guess, was the Great Battle of Finbar Plains, which I've been meaning to do a video on for a long time, but this battle was a massive joining of two hosts, one dark and one light, with major players like Tyrion and Teclis, Marathi and Malekith, Corhane Ironglaive and Urian Poisonblade. I mean, even Finbar kind of turns up at the last minute to say hi, kind of like a Muppet movie. But this whole ordeal is massive because of what it kind of galvanizes in the High Elves. The High Elves won, but it cost them dearly in both great heroes and men. But Finbar saw it fit to establish the loyalty of as many great heroes of the elf people that he could. And that's something to be said here, you know. For no matter how bleak the time seemed, there had never been more great heroes in the elven ranks than in the current era. And you really get this sense of that kind of majesty when we kind of hear about how this whole situation transpires with Malekith invading. This is really covered in earnest in the second and third books of the Tyrion and Teclis trilogy, where they really go into detail about this whole ordeal and really what it meant for Ulthuan. I mean, Ulthuan was pretty much like, okay, a Battle of Finbar Plains is not a success, then we all fall. Because Malekith came in so sweepingly and so destructively that he was weakening the wards around the island. He was trying to bring down the Great Vortex. There's a lot that goes on with that I'd like to do a whole separate video on, because it just really deserves its kind of limelight. But from here, Tyrion helps Finbar establish a strong kind of military might. Teclis does the same with the Mages of Sapphire, traveling to the Empire to educate and teach the realm of men how to use magic, you know, figuring that if they know magic, they can be a bastion against chaos. And as we close this chapter, I want to read from the 8th edition High Elf book a little paragraph. Now, this isn't meant to stir the old screw end times bandwagon. That's been beaten to a fucking horse, or beaten to a pulp, whatever it is. But I want to instill in you all of the hope we had for an amazing further of the story that we had been promised by these kind of open-ended passages that we're about to read right here. Yet every year brings new opportunities to win glory and fight against evil. There are still mighty elf heroes, courageous warriors, and mages willing to stand against the dark powers, and the mighty dragons, though few in number, are turning restless in their long sleep. In the north, the Witch King stirs once more, and the Widowmaker haunts the dreams of warriors, singing songs of forbidden glory to their desperate souls. Though they have dwindled and are weary, the High Elves still have a great part to play in the world before the final act of their long drama is played out. So, again, it's a very sweeping, over-the-top kind of passage here, but you definitely get this sense that, okay, there's going to be a shit ton more dragons are going to come back. Oh man, what's going to happen with these dark powers? Who's Malekith going to stay in power the whole time? Every single book has got something like this, where this is kind of like open-ended, very romantic, very sweeping passage where you're like, oh man, yeah, I'm glad I'm playing these guys, the good guys. Every book has got that. That's why there's such intense loyalty to every single faction in this game if you play the tabletop. But the dwarfs, while wrong, are very huge fans of their race. Same thing with greenskins, lizardmen, chaos, no one likes the vampires, empire, you know, everything like that has got this kind of innate kind of fervor attached to following in the, or not following in the footsteps, but an innate fervor attached to being a fan of that race. And that's why High Elves are kind of so near and dear to me. But with that, our line of kings comes to a close, and thus does the history of the elves. I suppose we'll continue with our end times video on the elven race to kind of put the button on the elven history as a whole, but that will be a clusterfuck in and of itself. Hopefully you guys got a great idea now of not just the Phoenix Kings, but the individual eras and epochs of the High Elf civilization. This video kind of acts almost as a retelling of the Book of Days, giving you guys details on the entire elf race from beginning to current era. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Got plenty more goodies planned for you, but have a good one and take care. Patreon, subscribe, comment, like it, all that action. But have a good one, guys. Bye.